introduction. Yeah, normally I think a lot about behavior and infectious disease, but today I'm going to be talking about our work looking at the authorship and citation landscape within our field. And before I get started, I want to say that this has been a big project, and a tremendous amount of the work has been done by our awesome postbac, Alexis Merritt, who's on this call and available to answer questions at the end. But yeah, she's done a ton of this work, and I want to make sure she gets the credit. So just to motivate this project, characterizing the diversity of a field is a key first step towards making research more inclusive and equitable. And we've seen some of these steps taken in other fields like neuroscience and physics, but to date, there haven't really been any analyses of what the field of infectious disease dynamics looks like. Historically, across most scientific disciplines, highly cited authors tend to be male and white. And this is meaningful because publications and citations have large consequences for visibility, career advancement, leadership opportunities, and credibility. Therefore, it's really important to both publish and cite equitably. So in this work, we ask, how do authorship and citation practices within the field of infectious disease dynamics vary by gender and race/ethnicity? And our results can help indicate what steps we can take going forward to make the field more equitable. So this project starts with defining our field. And unlike many other disciplines, infectious disease dynamics publications span a range of journals. So to define the field, we can't focus on a few specific journals. Instead, we turn to foundational published articles in the field, which have over 30 citations per year, and focus on mathematical modeling of infectious diseases at the population scale. Then we look at all the articles that cite these works and their reference lists. So to put that visually for you, if we have a highly cited infectious disease dynamics paper, we're looking at the papers that cite that paper. We consider this the authorship data set. And then we're looking at their bibliographies, which we consider the citation data set. And so for each paper in both data sets, we're going to infer the first and last author gender and race using machine learning packages. And then just to check for sensitivity, we consider a different definition of the field where we look at three key books: Anderson and May, Keeling and Rouhani, Diekman, Heisterbeck, and Britton. So what does our authorship landscape look like? First, I'm going to talk about gender. So here we can see the number of papers in the field over time. And what you'll see here is that the field has grown drastically since the turn of the century, but most papers have been published by men. So men dominate the first authorship and last authorship position, with a greater discrepancy in last authorship. If we instead look at the proportion of papers published by man first authors versus woman first authors, we can see that the proportion is relatively stable over time. So there hasn't been a lot of progress at decreasing this gap between man-published papers and woman-published papers. We can also look at how men and women collaborate. And so we can look at the first and last author together of each paper. So here we have woman first authored and woman last authored papers, woman first authored, man last authored papers, and so on. And what we can see is that man first authored and man last authored papers are clearly dominating the landscape with over 50% of publications, while any paper with a woman first or last author is relatively a small percentage of the publication landscape. And so you might notice here that our observed proportions are very similar to expected and be wondering what that means. And here the expectation is based on how men and women are pairing up to cite articles, but still with the same fraction of authors being men and women. So this is just saying that there doesn't seem to be a lot of bias in who is collaborating to write papers, as opposed to the fraction of women in the field is still really small. We plan to look at this further going forward. So now turning to race and ethnicity. Here again, we have the number of papers and the data publication. And here we can see that papers are predominantly written by white authors, with a growth in Asian first and last authors in the last decade, but very few papers are authored by Hispanic or Black authors. And I'll circle back to why we might be seeing a large number of Asian authors here. later. Next, we can look again at the proportion of papers and see that the trend persists that white authors are dominating, but this fraction does seem to be decreasing over time due to an increase in Asian authors. And then looking at the pairings, so now non-white first author, non-white last author. Fortunately, we have to get this down to a binary of white and non-white due to the sample size. And here we can see that, again, white first authored and white last authored papers are dominating, but the proportion is decreasing, particularly in the last decade or so. And here there seem to be more differences between the observed pairings of authors and the expectation, which we suspect is due to greater, perhaps geographical or other barriers to access of collaboration among authors of different races versus there being more mixing, like homogeneous mixing, basically, of genders. So lastly, turning to the citation landscape, here we're going to look at those bibliographies that I mentioned, and we need to restrict them to citations that are within the field of infectious disease dynamics. And so to do that, we're going to use a consensus approach, where references that are also cited by another authorship paper or already in the authorship data set are going to count. And we determine that threshold number of citations to be included based on the date of publication. So if you publish your paper more recently, there's a lower barrier to being included in this data set. The expected distribution of gender distribution of your bibliography is based on all the authorship publications that were published 1 month prior to the date of publication of that article. And sorry, I should have noted that this is only done for gender because of the sample size issues that I mentioned before. Then we calculate the percentage over and under citation by looking at the observed citations of paper type. So let's say woman first author, woman last author, divided by the expected citations of that type, minus 1 times 100%. And that gives us something that looks like this. So here we have the first and last authors on the x-axis and the over and under citation percent on the y-axis. And we can see that man first authored and man last authored papers are cited more often than expected by perhaps 8% or so. Whereas any paper, with a woman first or last author is undercited. And this trend is striking because it actually varies depending on the position of the woman authorship. So papers with a woman senior author are even more undercited than those with a woman first author but man senior author. So a few caveats to this work. Our definition of the field is imperfect. I will be the first to admit that. But the more we restrict the field, the more dire our results seem to be. And if anything, I think we're including more papers perhaps than truly our population scale models. And so we also confirm our results with that sensitivity analysis using the book's definition, and we find very similar, especially qualitative results. Secondly, gender and race/ethnicity inference is imperfect. And so we perform a sensitivity analysis for both of these identities with different software, but we're also limited to the fact that this software uses binary gender or quaternary race and ethnicity categories. And we know that that's not how these identities manifest in real life. So our next step is really to think about restricting our analysis to the global north, where we can evaluate specific biases. So thinking about where the barriers to entry might be more uniform and truly understand those better. And so that brings me back to my point about the rise in Asian authors recently, where we saw that if we restrict the data set to the global north, a lot of those papers by Asian authors drop out because they have affiliations in China. So we're not actually seeing a very big rise in Asian authors publishing in the global north. That's really a representation of different geographic distributions of publications. But all this to say, I think we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good here. We have to identify the problem in order to begin to address it. So some takeaways, depressing ones, unfortunately. More than half of recent publications are man-man or white-white authored, and the progress has been really slow. All papers we found with a first or last female author are undercited, even after we accounted for the lower fraction of papers authored by women. So our results suggest that our field has a long way to go in developing equitable citation and publication practices. The field is still dominated by men and white authors, and women aren't equitably cited. So on that dire note, I would be happy to take questions.